Could you please start by telling us a little bit about yourself, what you do at ANZ, and your experience working in finance?
Might actually start with an interesting anecdote. I'm actually an RMIT alumni, so I have a degree in economics and finance. I've actually done your course, the corporate finance course. So in terms of my ANZ background, I've been in the bank for about 16 years. All of that experience is in an area called institutional banking. That's focused on really complex customers, large global multinational corporates, large Australian corporates. My experience spans quite a number of different areas across the bank. That includes strategy, technology, risk, venture capital, corporate finance, and most recently, my present role is a director in institutional relationship. I have a portfolio of very large clients, and I'm their key contact point for large deals and any banking related products. That could be loans, it could be a markets or risk management product or transaction banking.
Let's start with the first question. In class, we spend a lot of time teaching students how to prepare and interpret cash flow forecasts as part of a capital budgeting analysis. It's a key part of evaluating whether a project is financially viable. When a business submits a funding proposal to the bank, I think those forecast projections are also a key part of your assessment. So from ANZ point of view, my question is, how do you assess the cash flow forecast that businesses provide? What gives you confidence that the numbers are credible? And what kind of things would raise concern?
Great question. Obviously, forecasts are vitally important. We are lending money for a period of time or a tenor, seeking to get that money back, either repaid or refinanced. So I guess the rigorousness of the assumptions is probably the most important thing. So what are the assumptions that drive that particular forecast? And those assumptions depend on the industry in which that company participates in. So it could be a revenue assumption, it could be a cost assumption, it could be a margin assumption, it could be cash flow around working capital. So what's driving those assumptions and what's the reasonableness of those assumptions? How we assess that is because we've got the largest market share, ANZ, across the institutional banking landscape in Asia Pac. So we know how the companies should be performing. So company A is in a particular industry and the forecast suggests margins of X. How does that line up against companies within our portfolio? If it is wildly out of whack or out of balance, then we would have a conversation with management that prepared those forecasts and seek to understand why they had that assumption. Now, there might be a great reason. They might, depending on the industry, they might have a particular product or have won a great contract that will lead to out of cycle or out of market performance. But generally, it is really the assessment of those forecasts and assumptions that's critical.
Now, building on that, I would like to zoom in a little bit more on the particular assumptions around revenues and costs. My question is, how does ANZ assess the reasonableness of revenues and cost assumptions in a capital budgeting proposal?
There's probably a few ways that we would do this. So one will be against historical performance. So are the revenue and cost and margin assumptions in line with that particular business in that particular industry? Then we would benchmark against like competitors in that geography generally to see if it is in line. If it's not in line, then we need to ask the question. As I said, we would workshop with the customer to understand what's driving those assumptions.
So speaking of understanding risk and assumption, we emphasize a lot about sensitivity analysis and scenario analysis. My next question is, from ANZ perspective, how important is it to see those analyses in a business proposal? And what kinds of stress tests or outcome ranges do you typically look for?
What I think it does most in terms of a proposal with a bank such as ANZ is it builds credibility. And what I mean by that is that if you are undertaking a sensitivity analysis, you're thinking about risk. So something might be going wrong. So generally a sensitivity analysis, we're looking at the downside as opposed to upside cases. So what could potentially go wrong? So would you lose a contract, or a particular tender that you're bidding for might not go through? And if that happens, what is the impact on cash flows, margins, business performance? And most importantly, from a bank's perspective, can you sustain the debt repayment or the debt servicing? So preparing those is really, really important. Even if the client doesn't do that, the bank will do sensitivity analysis to support any credit assessment of note.
So, thinking about those risks and what could go wrong, I'm curious about how ANZ handles risk internally. For example, if actual revenues end up significantly below the projections, like 25% lower, then how does that impact your credit assessment?
I think you need to start with the industry in which you participate. I'll give you an example. If you've got a contractor, for instance, that has a large capital project, let's just say you're making airplanes, and you don't deliver that airplane in the month of June, you deliver it in August. The revenue recognition for that contract is in the next financial year. So it might look really, really bad. But if you understand the industry and you understand the customer, you might accept that that's a timing mismatch. That's one particular example. If you're thinking about a customer or an industry that doesn't have those type of peaks and troughs in cash flow or seasonality, a general type of industry, then if the revenue declines by 25%, we would look to see how we've structured that. Most banks should be structuring with sufficient headroom. What that means is that if there is a downturn in that particular industry or business, their customer shouldn't trip up a covenant. And when I talk about a covenant, that's a protection for the bank and the customer to ensure that if things do deteriorate, we come to the table and have a conversation. And that conversation is, how can we help you navigate these industry or company specific changes? Obviously, a deterioration of 25%, probably not great. So the credit assessment probably has deteriorated, but these protections are in place for the customer and for the bank.
Now, I have another question. This might be a bit outside of the capital budgeting topic, but our students also learn about capital structure decisions. So my question is, from the bank's perspective, how do you evaluate the balance between debt and equity in a project? And what factors influence what's considered appropriate?
It's a very good question. I think it really depends on the industry. That's probably the most important starting point. That drives the level of debt and equity. I'll give you an example. So if you are in a heavily regulated industry with stable cash flows, think, electricity generation or, airports, utility type providers, level of debt that they can sustain is probably higher. Other lenses that you would apply would be the size of the business and also the country in which you operate. Generally, the larger the business, the more diversified, the more resources that they have. So you would probably enable a higher level of debt in that business. Some countries have got high levels of risk and lower levels of risk. So depending on what market you service, that will be another key point to determine the bank's view. Every bank should have their own appetite statement per industry sector that also has the lens of geography. That appetite will be a guideline on the capital structuring of a particular business in a particular industry. It doesn't mean that there's no exceptions. It's meant as a guideline to ensure the bank takes on customers that we think are adequately good risk assessment and companies that we want to bank.
earlier, when we were talking about how ANZ evaluates capital project proposal, you mentioned that industry benchmarking is one of the things you consider when reviewing the assumptions for costs and revenues. I would love to explore that a bit more. So, in particular, does ANZ typically look at market shares, projections, or industry benchmarks when you assess a business case? How do you evaluate whether a company's market assumptions, like expected growth and competitive position, are actually realistic?
ANZ being the dominant provider within the institutional market across Asia Pacific gives us a bit of a competitive advantage. So we have deep market share across pretty much most industries. That gives us industry insight. It tells us what type of margins should each business be generating, what's the working capital cycle, what's the growth rate. So any outliers against our own internal benchmarking might be of interest. That might be our performance, it might be deterioration, something to look at. It might be a reason to have a customer conversation. It is an information data point. It doesn't drive decisions, it just drives the conversation. We also use external data sources, so that might be broker reports, industry reports, and we use that to calibrate our assessment of the benchmarks in addition to what the company has provided us.
So far, we've been talking a lot about numbers like forecasts, ratios, evaluation methods, etc. All the things we spend time in class teaching our students. But as you know, number aren't everything. So my next questions for you is, in your experience at ANZ, what else do you look at when making a lending decision? What role does qualitative judgment play beyond just the financials?
Yeah, so there is a judgment overlay that's applied, and there are quite a host of qualitative assessments. So when I think about qualitative, I think about the industry. That's probably a key starting point. There's an old McKinsey report that says that industry is the greatest factor that drives financial performance. So understanding the industry and what life cycle that is in is pretty key. Then there's other things. So I think from an ANZ perspective, it's industries we know, companies we understand, and management we trust. They're kind of three lenses that drive our appetite for a particular business. So two examples. We've got one where we've got a 60-year relationship with the customer. We know everything about that relationship. We know the ebbs and flows, the seasonality, and we trust management through the upturns and the downturns, compared to a new to bank customer where we don't have that historical relationship. That looks great on paper. Now, isolate the two, one where we've got a historical relationship and business and management that we know and trust is going to be a more bankable name than a new to bank. So when we talk about qualitative factors, the extent of the relationship with the bank and the management trust that we have that's been brokered over a number of years is pretty important, and it helps to support the numbers on any credit assessment.
So to finish off, I would love to ask you a last question. What advice would you give to our students, our future business managers who are preparing a capital project proposal for external financing? What makes a proposal compelling and credible to lenders like ANZ?
Oh, great question. I think getting the numbers right is probably the ticket to the game, but it's not what wins you the match. So what really differentiates a proposal will be a deep understanding of the lens that the bank looks at. So it'll be incorporating sensitivity analysis. It'll be extensive due diligence. It will be providing us answers to the questions that we anticipate. So understanding the risk and also the mitigants of any projects or particular deal. So that's the qualitative or the extra bits that I guess make a capital project or a bank deal stand out. So proactively thinking about the answers to the questions that we haven't even asked yet.
Yeah, that's great advice, Mark. Thanks so much for sharing your experience and giving our students such practical real world insights. So thanks again for your time, and I'm pretty sure our student learned a lot from you today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to have a chat with you. It's been amazing.